Well, all right, everybody, welcome aboard. Thank you for joining in and checking out our latest edition of our 1920 Negro National League simulation, our talks that we've been having with everyone on here. And I'm going to get him up on the screen here right now. I am pleased to have Dr. James Brunson with us today. Welcome aboard, sir. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you.
All right. Uh, we were chatting just a little bit before we got going here, and it's a pleasure to have you on here. And I think people are really going to enjoy this one. It's going to be some themes that I think that there isn't a lot of information out there on. Early black baseball, going back to the beginning, and several of your books that you've written touch on that, and the research you've done and been involved with. I just think it's fantastic. As we were talking about earlier, I mean, what I'm trying to do here is get as many of these stories and these viewpoints and background information out there in front of people and maybe to a new audience by hitting the Twitch and simulation people, baseball people, because I guarantee you many have not heard these stories. So, again, welcome. I'm thrilled to have you on here. Thank you. And so, just real quick too, I know we talked about this, but you can maybe elaborate the class that you took. But I got your name and contact from a former student of yours, Paul Julian, who's I'm sure going to be watching here at some point today. So, what class did you were you teaching at the time when you met Paul?
Well, at the time, I was teaching art history courses and I was focusing in on visual culture. And at the time, um, hip hop was really popular. And this was late 1990s, early 2000s. And it was a class that was so exciting, I guess. I had Latinos, white students, black students, Asian students they saw themselves as part of that hip hop culture. So I developed a course to help critique and analyze not just the music, but the fashion, the lyrics, and other aspects of hip hop culture that were regarded as important to them. And the way the class was structured, there was a lot of interaction between students, and there was an opportunity for them to write from a personalized vantage point on the things that they thought were important to them, along with the traditional approaches to academic teaching. And one of the things that fascinated me is when you brought it up that Paul in particular somehow discovered baseball, which is, I'm always grateful for hearing somebody young interested in the game, not just from the vantage point of watching it or attending or participating, but
Mm-hmm.
understanding the history of it. And I'm really proud that he found his way there. And of course, I can't take any credit for him being interested in the game as he is today.
Oh, he was thrilled about your classes. It really inspired him, and he wants to hopefully take that next step and keep on going with this. I think that's another reason why I'm trying to do these is to try to touch that next generation that's going to take this next step. Because as we were talking about earlier, a lot of this, especially when it comes to early black baseball, the Negro Leagues, it's like archaeology. And so you being an art historian, this is like almost the same type of a concept. You're doing a lot of digging, right?
Yes, yes. And the first book that I wrote, and this came out in 2011, guess it's not showing up on the screen, but it was called
I'm
the
gonna I'm gonna throw them up in a little bit later, but go ahead. Yeah, put that on up there.
okay. It was the early image of black baseball, and it was a focus on the visual aspects of the game, but at the same time, the literary aspects of the game as constructed through word images. And my fascination had to do with um, this topic traces back to 1985. I was visiting relatives in St. Louis, and I was doing some research for an art project, some paintings I wanted to do. And I came across a story about a black baseball player in 1884 named uh, Isaac, who played for the St. Louis Black Stockings in St. Louis, and how he had been killed by this doctor, supposedly for attempting to burglarize his house. And I was consumed with this baseball character and the Black Stockings, and I began to dig into who the Black Stockings as a baseball team were. And I discovered all these countless numbers of black baseball teams in St. Louis from about 1867 down to 1900. And then I discovered that they were playing other teams. And especially being from Chicago, I was surprised to see that they were playing black Chicago teams. So that put me on my journey.
Awesome. So Paul held up that exact same book that you just held up as uh, proof positive of everything that you've been doing. So I'm glad that you brought that up. Now, one thing I wanted to ask you about, it mentions a 3 volume set.
Yes.
Where's the 3 volumes? Is there 2 others,
Well,
or is that the
this
other
was the
one?
first book that came out in 2011, and then Black Baseball, and this is volume one. It's a 3 volume set. It's 1,300 pages,
Holy moly!
and it deals with, as it states, a comprehensive record of teams, players, managers, owners, and umpires from 1858 to 1900. So part of my, I guess, my intensity toward the topic had to deal with always reading these stories by a lot of well-known baseball historians that we know now, and asking myself the question, what is it that they didn't talk about that I wanted to know? And if I wrote a book, what would I talk about that they didn't cover? And I was always fascinated by the discovery of teams with rosters. I was fascinated with individual players and the continuity of a player, for example, playing for more than 1 or 2 years. And what I've discovered, there are black ball players that were playing as early as 1859 and were still playing 20 years later. Now, this is in the 19th century, mind you.
Mm-hmm.
Now, these aren't amateur players as far as I'm concerned. These are professional ball players. Anybody's playing 15 to 20 years consecutively, you got to tip your cap to somebody doing that.
Absolutely.
So I was also fascinated by games where there were black umpires overseeing not only black ball games, but there were black umpires that were umpiring games between black and white teams. And the earliest teams I discovered always carried an umpire. They always carried an umpire, and I suspect it was probably done in baseball in general. So when, let's say, for example, if I was a black baseball team in Brooklyn or Williamsburg, New York, and I went to play in Utica, New York, or if I went to play in some other town north of where I was originally from, I always brought with me an umpire. So it was either a 1 umpire system or a 2 umpire system. And if you know anything about baseball, it was a rarity early on
Mm-hmm.
in baseball where you would actually have 2 umpires covering a game.
Mm-hmm.
So we have already in black baseball the fact that 2 umpires, one probably behind the plate or on the side of the plate, and another one behind second base, to ensure that there was a level of fairness that was occurring between the 2 teams that were engaged in a baseball match.
Awesome. In your books, because baseball, the rules of baseball have changed so much. I mean, the game, I'm going to have somebody on in a few weeks that's a vintage baseball. They play 1845 like Knickerbocker rules, I believe, or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But do you go into that much in your books as well? Do you talk about the way the game has changed from the beginning?
Well, I haven't covered that so much, and one of the reasons why is because I really wanted to zoom in on the history of the people
Hmm.
playing the game.
Okay.
I wanted to know who these individuals were, if possible, when they were born, when they died, the number of positions that they may have played when they were on a specific team, if they played for more than one team. Those were always the things that fascinated me about the game.
Hmm.
And my approach to it, some might say is sociology. I don't necessarily see it as such. I see it as an understanding of the contextualizing the era in which these individuals played the game and what they came out of. And as I prefaced uh, prior to us coming online, uh, we need to understand that when we talk about black baseball, particularly before 1868, black men were playing baseball and they were still not citizens of the United States.
That's right.
So, one of the things that was fascinating for me is, for example, there was a baseball club in Baltimore organized in 1859 known as the Lord Hannibals. These individuals hosted a baseball tournament in 1859 in Baltimore. In Baltimore, for those that may not know, was a slave state at the time. So many people came to Baltimore to witness this tournament, which was part of a weekend picnic hosted by black barbers throughout the region. That the next year, the city passed a law stating that blacks could not hold picnics that had more than 100 people because over 2,000 people showed up.
Oh my
And
goodness.
the the possibility or the mere thought of people attempting to escape, and I suspect some of that may have taken place, triggered this initiation of this law.
Interesting.
Um, and something else that I want to emphasize too, and we really don't think about it. I did an interview for the Josh Gibson Foundation
Hmm.
uh, a month or so ago, and one of the people who was listening posed the question is, how did black teams get around? And I was amused by the thought of it. And I just had to point out, well, you need to look at it like this. They used the same transportation that everybody else was using. They
Hmm.
used steamships throughout the country, and they used trains like everybody else did.
Hmm.
The problem was blacks weren't allowed to sit in the same cars as whites. So
Hmm.
that when a baseball team traveled, they often rode in a freight car or they paid extra money to have a special car attached to the train car so that
Wow.
they can have their own comfort and privacy.
Wow.
And again, when you think about it, most folks, we don't think about those things because it's just not a part of how we want to view baseball. We just want to view it as, well, they were doing what everybody else was doing. Well, no, not quite.
Right.
And within that same context, many places would not allow them to stay in the hotels, let
And
alone eat in a restaurant.
that's right. In all these conversations that I've been having, and you just touched on it, I've been trying to point that out. Uh, you cannot take today's view of baseball of 162 games and traveling and their statistics and everybody was you know following it along in the newspapers. Much of it in the early days in at all levels was a lot um, less standardized, let's just say, right? So you had all of these teams and players playing, and believe me, before I started uh, uh, looking at your work and others, I had no idea before 1880, 1870 something. Because the first person you always hear about is Bud Fowler, players
Sure.
like that, the Walker brothers. You don't hear anything at all about black baseball before the 1870s, And that's why I think your books are so fascinating and so important for people to dig into, because it was there for a long, long time. And you can't take today's perceptions of things and apply it. You have got to put yourself back in that time period in order to understand what was going on and what they were having to deal with, and how they did it. And it's just fascinating. It really, really is.
Well, it's astonishing too, in a wide variety of senses. Let me give another example. The team that became known as the Cuban Giants uh, was a combination of several teams. It was a combination of the Keystone Athletics out of Philadelphia. It was members of the Manhattan Baseball Club out of Washington, D.C. And then there was a smattering of players from the Philadelphia Orions out of Pennsylvania as well. But then again, there were some of these other players that came in and out. But black baseball is significant for another reason in the 19th century. I would argue comfortably with any scholar that wants to talk about baseball and its connection to spring training or winter baseball. Black baseball players are arguably the earliest players to engage in winter baseball that we know of. These guys initially set up shop in Saratoga Springs, New York, where the best players used the Saratoga Springs hotels as a place where they played.
Mm-hmm.
And when the summer hotel season was over and they worked as waiters in these overwhelmingly white, well-to-do communities, they packed up and they moved south to Florida and Arkansas, Hot Springs, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
where they worked in the hotels there, because that's where wealthy white folks who didn't want to deal with the cold, they moved south for the warm weather. And here they served as waiters, but they also entertained the people of that community. I call it the hotel waiter subculture. And they played baseball. And they were doing that as early as 1872.
Amazing. Talk a little bit about what we were talking about before we went live, about the we're not, no one's trying to mythologize um, these players. The thing that when Major League Baseball made that announcement to bring the 7 leagues to the status, there were professional players already, and they were doing it for a living, and that was, under the conditions that they had to deal with. Um, what you know what we were talking about earlier was how uh, why the mythology started, and if you can talk about that, I thought it was just fascinating.
Well, the first articles that I had written were intimately tied to my first book, The Early Image of Black Baseball. And what that mythology has to do with was blackface minstrelsy. Mm-hmm. Now, some folks probably know about, because it is perpetuated or pervasive on the internet, where you'll see people blacked up for a wide variety of things, even today, whether they students on college campuses or, what have you. But blackface minstrelsy was initially established around 1828 by Irish performers who eventually made a great living doing it. They would black up themselves. They would learn black music, ways that black people sang, and they learned it by going to observe them on plantations where these people were enslaved. And they brought these practices back to New York, which was the hub at the time and still is, the Big Apple, and they performed on stage. And this became pervasive at multiple levels. And by pervasive, I mean that it penetrated advertising, it penetrated the stage, it penetrated the visual arts, it penetrated music. But in our point of interest, it penetrated baseball as well. given the fact that it had at least 40 years over what we recognize now as the first appearance of a black baseball team's its public face, writers, journalists, and visual artists working for newspapers and magazines constructed an image of black baseball players as minstrels. Mm-hmm. So it didn't matter whether they were good or not. Mm-hmm. The point being made is, if we're going to represent them, we're going to represent them in a way that reinforces or perpetuates our view, at least at that time, of the enslavement of Africans throughout the United States. Mm-hmm. So black baseball early on was not seen as serious. It was seen as jovial. It was seen as mirthful. The portrayal of these individuals, whether journalists were writing about black baseball or our visual artists were representing black baseball, artists like Thomas Worth or Solomon Itenji Jr. for Harper's Weekly. They portrayed black baseball players as either jovial and happy or just disastrous. They couldn't play the game. You know, they hurt themselves even trying to play the game. But we know for a fact that the first professional black team in the United States appeared in 1870, 1 year after the Cincinnati Red Stockings. It appeared in St. Louis, the St. Louis Brown Stockings. And we know this to be a fact because they sent a notice to a newspaper in Utica, New York, requesting the names of the secretaries for the black baseball teams in the state of New York. They also submitted, and this is what kills me, Philip, they submitted an advertisement to the New York Clipper requesting anybody who was a left-handed pitcher and a catcher, and stating that they would be paid well for joining their team. Now, this is just a phenomenal thing, mm-hmm. and this isn't talked about at all. And it flies in the face of the mythology that continues to be perpetuated by the Hall of Fame Museum that says that the Cuban Giants were the first, the Trenton Cuban Giants were the first professional black team. It's just not true. Mm-hmm. There were countless, and I talk about it in my book, and the book that Todd Peterson wrote, I submitted an article. I identified at least 10 or 12 professional black teams before the Cuban Giants ever showed up.
Interesting.
So that's one of the myths that needs to be addressed. And the other myth that I talked about, we need to understand that black baseball clubs and black baseball players were not, and I repeat, these were not minstrel shows and these performances were not minstrels. Mm-hmm. But what struck journalists at the time when they saw them play was they were so good at what they were doing. And I'm talking about the good teams. I'm not talking about all the teams. I'm talking about the teams that were good. They were so good that they made the game seem too easy. So they started referring to them as flamboyant, engaged in circus-like play. And a primary example of one of these players who's now in the Hall of Fame was Ulysses Franklin Grant, or Frank Grant. Mm-hmm. Sports writers that talked about this guy all the time, they thought he was too flamboyant. They thought he was too flashy. This was a guy that he would make hard plays look easy. And that's how they described him. And this is what a lot of these black players from the 1870s down to the 1880s, this is what they look like on the field. They were phenomenal players. And as I talked to you earlier, there's a couple of players that showed up in like 1859. The team that comes to mind is the Williamsburg Colored Unions. And they eventually evolved over time to become the Williamsburg Uniques. There's a couple of brothers, the Furman brothers, and then there is up in Long Island, Jamaica, Long Island, there was another player that played for the Unknowns, and then he eventually played for the Long Stars. This guy played for 20 years too. So we're talking about players that were playing professional years, as far as I'm concerned, as related to baseball.
So that's the thing I've been trying to stress. Exactly what you just said about, that there's this element out there. I'll just say that somehow thinks that all of these players who played in the Negro Leagues were minor league talent at best, and it's just not true. I mean, when you look at when Jackie Robinson does finally get to break the color barrier in '47, for the next decade to 15 years most of the most valuable player awards in both leagues were won by former Negro League players or black players. They didn't just spring out of the earth. They were there and they were able to play. And had they given the opportunity earlier, it would have changed the game's history. And it's to the loss of all baseball fans that was not allowed. It's an unfortunate thing. And anyway, like I said, I think these are the kinds of stories I hope people start to understand because they need to be told. So, one of the things I wanted to ask you. So you got some of the early players that are noted, like the Bud Fowlers, and so the whole Cooperstown, myth. He was from Cooperstown, correct? Right? That wasn't even his name, right? It was John
John W. Jackson.
Jackson, right? So why did he become associated with being the first player I'm not sure what year that was, but it was probably in the 1870s. I'm thinking.
Yeah, 1878. He played with a team called the something Oaks,
So
and
the Rochester Live Oaks. I don't. There was a couple of Oaks, but
no, I think
my question.
this was in Massachusetts. The team that he played
So
with.
I was just wondering though, with that connection, like, was it because of some narrative? There's always some narrative, like you're talking about with the writing of the day to make it seem like, you know, flashy, flamboyant minstrel show that you want to you're trying to shape people's perceptions. So was there some of that with the Cooperstown with Bud Fowler or not?
Well, one of my favorite 19th century characters is Phineas T. Barnum. And this guy knew how to sell anything. And I think that baseball appeared at a time, and it's important to stress this, some of the earliest professional teams were owned by circus men. And I I would argue that black baseball players were well aware of what P.T. Barnum did in selling himself. And I think that that's what John W. Jackson did. He
Interesting.
sold himself to the public. And he talked about what he did and said how great he was, and he should be in the Hall of Fame. There's no doubt about it, because he played with black and white teams and he played for a long time. But Fowler, I've always, again, and I said to you offline, I've never been satisfied with the basic information that everybody else is just circulating. And it circulates so much till it becomes rock solid.
Yep.
But at the same time, it's a myth. Nobody has bothered to invest into why this is and why we continue to allow it to go. I discovered that Henry Bridgewater, who was the manager owner for the St. Louis Blackstockings from 1882 to about 1887, was close friends with Bud Fowler. And Bud Fowler showed up in New Orleans in 1882, and he played in a colored league down there composed of around about 8 teams in New Orleans. Now, they weren't all from New Orleans. They were some from the outskirts of around the city, but he was a pitcher for the New Orleans Unions, and then he pitched for the New Orleans Pickwicks, and he came during the off season of 1882, and he pitched for Henry Bridgewater, St. Louis Blackstockings, in November of 1882. So we can find these people if we want to.
It's
My
interesting.
take on it, again, is to always be critical, if nothing else, with the information that we gain access.
We talked about this before. The thing about digging into this history And there's people like you and so many others. I had Phil Dixon on the other day. I had Kevin L. Mitchell, Todd Peterson, Pete Gorton, several others we're going to have coming on in the coming months to tell these kinds of stories. But there's constantly new information being found, and it's almost like archaeology of any other form, whether it be art or the dinosaurs. You may have what could be perceived as the truth today, but then as new information comes to light, it will overlap that, overshadow that, change it. Doesn't make what was being said before completely wrong, but it does need to change your perceptions of things, and that's why I think your work is just yeah, more people need to know about it because it does overlap. It precedes everything, and it would change perceptions of how people viewed it from there going forward. Because it the Bud Fowler stories you were just telling. One of the things I put out the other day on Twitter. I live down here in Texas, and when Texas before 1920 in the Negro National League, there were several other leagues that had started up in various areas. Texas tried to start a Negro League in the late 1890s. Who did they ask to run it? Bud Fowler. And they did it for exactly the reasons you just said, that he knew, he was well known, people knew him, and that he could make it work. He could put the show on the road, so to speak, I guess.
Well, he wrote his own story,
Mm-hmm.
and again, some people may know this and others may not. He was also a playwright. He wrote a play in the 1880s, and he also was a wrestler. He wrestled in Illinois. So this guy was. I mean, this would have been a P.T. Barnum dream.
Absolutely. So let's talk about some of these other guys that need to have a little bit of light shown on them. So today, um, I believe, is the day uh, that Fleet Walker passed away many years ago, right? So,
Yes.
so John Thorne was the one who he said that nobody knows more about early baseball than you do, but the name William Edward White came up as preceding both Bud Fowler and the Walker brothers. What can you tell us about William Edward White?
Well, I don't know if he precedes Bud Fowler. They may be equal in the sense that William White, we first identify him. He was playing for Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, and he was playing first base. And the Providence team, the Providence Grays, was so impressed by him at the time that they recruited him to play for them, and he allegedly played one game for them. And I think it was discovered that he was passing, or that he wasn't what they thought he was. And he played one game, and he disappeared. However, that same player, White, played for several teams, including the Boston Resolutes, which was a black team. And he eventually worked his way. Henry Bridgewater, again from the St. Louis Blackstockings, recruited him to pitch. He played for the St. Louis Blackstockings in 1883. So after that, he migrated slowly back to the East Coast, and he played for several black teams. And again, as we all know, he eventually played for the Trenton Cuban Giants, and he played for the New York Gorhams. And he kind of faded from view after 1890, but I suspect he probably was still playing. But he was considered a phenomenal pitcher at the time. You can best believe Henry Bridgewater would not have brought him to St. Louis to pitch for him if he didn't think he had the goods.
That's right. Another one, and I'm originally from Pennsylvania, moved in the 90s down here to Texas, but I was familiar with him because I'm also a little bit of a Civil War buff. I grew up not too far from Gettysburg and north of Philadelphia,
Wow,
and so
impressive.
it just fascinated me. But Octavius Cato, they put a statue up outside of the I want to say the courthouse or somewhere down. I haven't been back to Philadelphia itself in many, many years. But when that statue went up, there were many people who had no idea who even he was.
Yes.
And but his legacy and his work and it's just a fascinating story that I wish more people did know more about.
Hmm. Well,
So what? So Octavius Cato, I know he fought in the Civil War, which is how I had first heard about him, or was a Civil War veteran. But he actually played baseball going back to like I want to say the Philadelphia teams that I remember reading about were like the Pythians and several others. Correct?
yes. And even before the Pythians, he played baseball and he played cricket. He went to the black school that eventually was identified with, uh, uh, um, and the name of the school is escaping me at the time, but it was primarily a black school, and he played cricket and he played baseball for them. And I think the name of the team that he played for at that school was it was called the Browns. However, the team that he came to be captain for was the Philadelphia Pythians, and they were organized officially in 1866. And the Pythians were a powerhouse without a doubt at the time. However, the Pythians had their hands full with another black baseball team in Philadelphia, the National Excelsiors. And the National Excelsiors are significant because the the president of that club, who was also a player, his first cousin was the captain and president of the Albany, New York Young Bachelor Club. That was James, and I'm, I'm forgetting the names of these guys. I'd have to look them up very
That's all
quickly.
right.
But there was this triangular arrangement between the Pythians, the Bachelors, and the National Excelsiors, and they played each other. And the National Excelsiors organized in 1865, and this was a tough group of guys right here. Now, again, just a point of information with all baseball teams at this time, um, these clubs were exclusive clubs, meaning you had to be a member of this club. You had to be a person that lived in the community. You had to be a person that was, if not a close friend or relative, certainly somebody who would be accepted into these exclusive groups.
Mm-hmm.
But the young bachelors out of Albany were interesting because the team for the most part was composed of black barbers. And one of the theses that I make an argument with is the earliest black baseball teams were either barbers or waiters or a combination of the two. And what made the young bachelors so powerful was the fact that their players came, it wasn't an exclusive group as we know them. They came from several different towns and cities in New York. And they were rough. They came, they did tours. They toured, they came down into New Jersey. They played in Delaware, and then they played in Pennsylvania, particularly in Philadelphia, and they beat everybody up real good from 1865 to 1866. And it wasn't until 1867 that finally the Pythians got their act together, and they were able to defeat these guys under the leadership of Octavius Cato.
So his statue is not up in front of, I believe it's City Hall in Philadelphia for his baseball prowess, but he used baseball. He was his legacy goes beyond. I mean, he was a civil rights activist going way back into the 1860s and 70s. Correct? I mean, and he you kind of used baseball as another one of those legs to promote that. which to me is fascinating. We're talking 150 years ago that someone was using that stage in order to promote civil rights and activism. I just think it's awesome. It's a fascinating story.
And Philip, you've raised an excellent point, and I want to bring particular attention to the fact that many of these ball players in the 1850s and 1860s and 1870s, they were all civil rights activists.
Mm-hmm.
We just know, and again, it's like I talked to you before, it's this mythology. We find this one singular person and we elevate them to this pantheon and say that that's it, but it's not true. And when Octavius Cato was assassinated, he was not the first black ball player to be assassinated. There was a black ball player in Baltimore, Maryland, playing for the Lord Baltimores, who was assassinated because of his political activism.
Mm-hmm.
So Cato follows him. And,
Interesting.
and again, it's just the dynamic of it. Most when you drill deep into these black baseball teams of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you will discover that many of them were Lincoln Republicans. But here's the rub. When you find black barbers who were playing baseball, whether it be in the North or the South, many of them were Democrats. And they identified with the former Confederacy. And not that they were identifying with Confederates, but the people who were their customers, their white customers, they still were fighting the Civil War. And their drive or their desire was to maintain that clientele base that they had. That's why St. Louis, again, is one of those infamously or notorious stories where a dialogue or a critique needs to be ongoing. Henry Bridgewater was a Lincoln Republican, hardcore, but his major rival or his major rivals were always black baseball clubs where they were Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't just that they were fighting hard on the diamond. When they left the diamond politically, they were lining up either as Democrat or Republican, and a lot of it often resulted in violence. And I'm sure you know the story of the murder that occurred down in St. Louis in 1896, where Henry Bridgewater's the Stagger Lee story, where Henry Bridgewater's nephew was killed because he was advocating for the Republican Party, and he was killed by a black Democrat on the other side of the fence. And that's where we get the story, the legend of Stagger Lee.
Interesting. But I tell you, these types of stories, I mean, context and content and how you wrap your head around it all is so important. Like I said earlier, so many people want to just take the story of baseball or whatever it is that they're talking about and put it into today's terms, and you just can't. Things are so different than they were 50 years ago, let alone 100 years ago. I mean, it blows me away that here we are 100 years from the last pandemic in 1918, 1919,
yes,
and repeating some of those same things again in the same fashion. It's just, boy, it really, if you don't know your history, right, as the saying goes, right, you're doomed to repeat it.
You're doomed to repeat it. And
That's right.
and again, I'm a member on Facebook of the Negro Leagues page, and it just amuses me. And I try to stay out of those conversations, and I just let them go. But the other day, someone posted a story about the birthday of George Johnson Jr., who played for the Page Fence Giants, but he went on to have a great career in the 1900s.
Mm-hmm.
And they were talking about these teams that he played for, and I was irritated because they had just simply erased or they didn't know that this guy played baseball before he joined the Page Fist Giants. So
Mm-hmm.
because I had written my brief biography on him in the book on black baseball, I just simply went in there and I typed in that, origins have value and have meaning. And I wanted to point out that this guy just didn't show up all of a sudden with the Page Fist Giants,
Mm-hmm.
that he had played for teams in West Virginia, in Bel Air and Wheeling, West Virginia. And he had, just like Satchel Paige, he had some problems as a child, and he got shipped off to a reform school in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, before he came back to West Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
And then it wasn't until 1898 that he was recruited and hired by the Page Fist Giants at, $65 a month in the year of 1898. And I just thought it was important. People need to understand that
Mm-hmm.
we need to be critical of ourselves and
Mm-hmm.
critical of what we read.
What you just said, that's a great term, the origin story, right? Like a superhero kind of thing, right? But
Sure.
like I mentioned to you even before we got on here, what has bothered me over the decades and decades of poking at this is the thought that all of a sudden, after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in 1947 and players came into the major leagues, that they just sprang out of the earth. And
Exactly.
Monty Irvin, he never played in the Negro Leagues, and Jackie Robinson didn't play there for several seasons, and so many others that no, their origin story goes back much further, and it's interesting the way
Exactly.
you put that into really good context because it's more than just these 1947 and beyond players. You just said a story about a guy who was playing at the turn of the 19th to the 20th centuries, that his origin story is still kind of lost in all this. So yeah, I mean these are great conversations. I think they're just fascinating.
And again, the Walker boys, Fleetwood and Wiley Walker, these
Willie, yeah.
guys, we when we first discover them, typically what we find out is already Fleetwood Walker is playing either with the University of Michigan or he's playing with the Toledo Mud Hens,
Mm-hmm.
the first professional team.
Mm-hmm.
But the bottom line is that's 1882, 1884. I've discovered or uncovered through archaeology, both the brothers were playing as early as 1874.
Mm-hmm.
And
Touch on
again,
touch on that. Touch on that real quick when you're done with this story about how do you go about digging that.
Well, as a methodology, when I'm doing research on black baseball, I have to ask myself the question is, what is the language that I can use to cover the possibilities when I'm using these search engines? There's the newspaper archive,
Mm-hmm.
there's newspaper.com, there's genealogy bank, and on and on and on. And I use about 5 chronologing America that's coming out of Washington, D.C. So when I'm looking at all these search engines, these archival newspapers, I'm thinking about a language. So I've developed a ranging list of words
Mm-hmm.
that would apply if I'm looking for black teams.
Mm-hmm.
Anything from colored club to black ball to the more esoteric Sons of Ham to colored troops showed up. There's a whole range of words and phrases that will allow you to gain access to black baseball teams. And I was doing some research when I was putting together my book on West Virginia. And there were several teams. One team was called the Blackfeet. And when I was doing this research on them, I came across this player who had been playing since the 1860s. His name was Peanut Scott. His actual name was John Couch. And he was known or famous because he sold peanuts in the community. but he was also a baseball player. And his fame extended not just from West Virginia, but its fame stretched over into Ohio. So without a doubt, he came across the Walker brothers playing for an all-black team, which was called the Colored Champions in 1874. And he invited them, as was typical of the time, he invited them to come down and play against them in Wheeling, West Virginia. And of course, the Colored Giants with the Walker boys crushed them badly, but they developed a rivalry where they played each other home and home games every year.
Mm-hmm.
And the point I want to make is when we think about the Walker boys, let's not pretend that they just showed up in 1882
Mm-hmm.
at University of Michigan or at, and again, folks rarely talk about it, but Moses' brother, he also played for the Mud Hens for at least 1 year. They played together for a year.
Mm-hmm. What's your take on? It was around that time we're talking into the 1880s, and the mythologized story, and one for what that's worth, about when the color barrier, because obviously this is the time of Jim Crow. Things were changing after the Civil War, especially in the South. People who are interested at all in history may know the stories about why the Jim Crow laws, why the statues went up. I mean, I didn't want to get into that as to why there's statues of Robert E. Lee up in certain places, but it all came out of post Civil War and Jim Crow, right? And it happened many decades after the Civil War. But the color barrier in baseball has always been like kind of put at the feet of Cap Anson for whatever newspaper article, whatever. What's your take on that? Was it? Is he part of it? Was there more to it? What do you think happened there?
Well, again, that's another one of those myths that, depending on whose ox you want to gore, folks want to use him as the fall guy. And it was one of those things, too, that I read so much about it that I had to dig into it. And I just became really dismissive of Adrian Cap Anson being the guy that did this. And folks continue to want to do it. They will identify a black player, whether it was Bud Fowler, whether it was a black pitcher, and he said, and that triggered it. No, that's not how it happened. White teams did not want to play black teams across the country, period, way before Cap Anson showed up. It goes back to the 1850s.
Mm-hmm.
So they did not want to play these guys because to play them was to signify equality, social equality, democracy. So Cap Anson is just somebody that was being used to buttress this mythology, and folks like to use it, well-meaning or not, and I'm just not willing to accept that. And part of it is what we need to recognize too is black teams were playing white teams still. Black teams were playing white teams in New York in the 1870s. Black teams were playing white teams in Chicago, and let me be clear. In Louisiana, New Orleans, if this is the place where the separate versus equal law was introduced in 1896. The Pickwicks, the New Orleans Pickwicks, played white teams in the 1870s and 1880s in New Orleans. So we know those types of games occurred because they wanted to play the best teams. And aside from that, big money could be had as it related to playing these games.
And that's what it all comes down to, doesn't it? I've had these conversations now for, like I said, 6-8 weeks again. It all comes down to the money, doesn't it? I mean, this was who the players, the owners, the stadium owners, the booking agents, whoever was involved in all this, that's what it came down to. And the fact of the matter was, if a black team, a Negro League team later on into the 1900s came through town, you could bet people were going to come and see them play because that's where they could make some money.
Well, let's put this in the context of what you just said. Henry Bridgewater, whether he played a black team or white team, and he played white teams too in St. Louis, he demanded that at least $100 be put up on a game.
Wow.
Now, calculating in today's money, that would be $2,000. When the Pickwicks played a team out of Southern Georgia, in 1885 in New Orleans, the money on the table that they both agreed to was $500 a side.
Mm-hmm.
That's $10,000 in
Mm-hmm.
today's money. That
Mm-hmm.
is not. That's how good these guys were that they were willing to play against them.
Mm-hmm. No,
So
I hear you.
it's just it's to me it's and again the other thing that you got to remember is black ball clubs in some of these major cities, whether they were playing against each other or playing against white teams, the Chicago Uniques, the Chicago Gordons, they were playing in Wisconsin regularly on Memorial Day or the 4th of July, and they got guarantees from those white clubs that they played against for $200 a game, and they would play for 2 or 3 games in a weekend. So,
that's that's the other context that people miss out today. Everybody's so used to today of not only the 162 game schedule and who's in first and who's batting and what somebody's launch angle is and whatever baloney that they're measuring now. But if you didn't play, you didn't get paid, and you were playing like you just pointed out, sometimes 2, 3 games a day, 5 games on a weekend, every day of the week, and in between you were traveling. I mean, that was a grind that these guys were going through. Yeah.
oh yeah, it was a grind. And let's just remember this: for many of those black teams, they couldn't get hotel accommodations.
Right,
They had
right.
to sleep
Now,
outside. They had to pay somebody to probably sleep inside of a school, or they had to maintain contact with these black communities in some of these towns, and pay to get the black folk that lived in those communities to put
mhm.
them up for the night or for the weekend.
Yeah, there you go. Now layer all of this, the Jim Crow and the segregation and the this. I mean, I challenge anybody today to go back 100 years ago and try to duplicate what these guys were doing and perform at the level that they were performing at. It's oh man, I'll tell you, it's just amazing.
I just ask, man, that anybody that is serious about doing this research is that they take these things into
Hmm.
consideration. And however you want to deal with it, if you want to deal with stats, fine, deal with stats. And there's enough stats, even though people say that there aren't any stats for black baseball or black baseball players in the 20th century. We know that's not true.
Hmm.
Stats do exist in the 19th century. They are there.
Hmm.
You just got to be willing to do some work. And it is work.
Hmm.
It's the best part of the work for me. I'm not interested so much in the stats, but I know I've got access to that information if I needed to do it. I'm interested in these storylines. Where did these people come from?
Right.
And to
Yes.
see a player evolve from 13 years old to 30, that is just rewarding for me to read or trace that type of player.
I mean, I just put out the other day about Biz Mackey. He was 15 years old when he first started playing in the Negro Leagues. He was 50 when he was still playing, and it blows me away. It blows me away. I mean, you talk about a guy's career and devoted to one thing in his life. I mean, these stories are just fascinating. I'm going to throw up on the screen here real quick your books so you can just touch on them and talk about it. I think these are reads that people should absolutely take a look at. The first one I got up is the 1858 to 1900, the comprehensive record of teams, players, managers, umpires. I mean, you touched on it a little bit earlier. Um, a
Well,
little
sure.
synopsis of this.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I want to emphasize, if you're going to do a study of black baseball, you've got to contextualize who are these players, where they came from.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that has been significant for me is black baseball, as we know it, was the nexus point for professionalism, black professionalism. And the players that at the earliest stages were either barbers or waiters. And while we might be dismissive of these occupations today, these were middle class occupations for black people that couldn't get into other professions. And
Mm-hmm.
these individuals are significant because they had the mobility to travel if they needed to play games. You know, many other jobs, you couldn't have been able to just pack up and go somewhere and do what you wanted to do. You
No.
know, you had to work your job 5, 6 days a week, maybe 7 days a week. But being a waiter, you had a lot of excess time on your hands, what I call leisure time, to play the game. And barbers too.
Mm-hmm.
Black barbers were so good from the 1850s to the 1880s. Teams like the Chicago Unions that became well known in the 1890s and early 1900s. These guys, they were all barbers, and they were good. And the thing is, they had mobility on their side. They could leave their journeyman barbers, young guys who they had trained. They could operate the shop for a weekend, and these guys would go on the road and play baseball and come back and be ready to get back into the barber seats, you know, on Monday morning. But the
Mm-hmm.
teams that were real good had a hookup. And by hookup, I mean they had older men who were barbers who weren't baseball players or had been baseball players. And these guys would manage the shops. And the young guys that played baseball, they would pack it in and they'd be gone for a week or 2 weeks playing baseball before they come back.
Mm-hmm.
So we really need to understand the significance of occupation. And if anybody's listening to this, if they're going to do any serious research on black baseball in the 19th century, they need to start with black barbers and black waiters at around the country.
Awesome. I just think it's a staggering work to go back to 1858 and recreate and document some of these things. I recommend this to anybody who's interested in finding out not just more about uh, black baseball, but just the period itself and the history itself and how it all impacted everything. Because just like everything else, everything that happens, nothing happens in a vacuum. And that's another thing I think that gets lost when you talk to people about certain topics is you you end up talking about it like in the echo chamber or in the vacuum, and you've got to really make sure that you get you know above that and look at it all in total, because otherwise you're missing the context. So next one I got up here, the early images of black baseball,
Sure.
race and representation. So this is a little bit more not just on baseball, but also gets more into other aspects of the time period as well. Correct?
Sure. And one of the things that I want to emphasize about that, and I'm going to read just a brief blurb about this period that is in the introduction as relates to the early image of black ball. And it goes as this. In the 1870s and 1880s, black images of the colored sporting fraternity, I use the word colored because it's appropriate for the period, baseball barons, ball players, umpires, fans, prize fighters, musicians, tonsorialists, which is barbers or fancy hairdressers, gamblers, and other underworld types proliferated and circulated widely throughout the country. Among the more dubious legacies of postbellum Gilded Age culture, the period of economic ascendancy in the United States following the Civil War, is that artists and writers had distanced themselves from the social system that had grown up around them. So when I say that, I want to emphasize the fact that in order to understand, or one way of understanding black baseball in the 19th century is to look at images, whether they are
Mm-hmm.
visual images created by visual or graphic artists, or more specifically, if you don't have that kind of time, when you read the text of sports journalists or writers for newspapers of the period,
Mm-hmm.
how they talk about and describe black baseball. Already in 1859 and 1860, journalists are referring to black baseball players as minstrel performers, and
Mm-hmm.
that they're entertaining, and that they are fun, and that they are mirthful, and that they are joyful. And what they're doing is they are framing how we are to imagine black baseball. And
Yes,
we've got to give that up if we're going to be serious scholars. We've got
that's
to
right.
penetrate deeply into what do they mean when they're doing that, which
Hmm.
means that we have to contextualize these writers. Blackface minstrelsy, as I talked to you about it before, was at its height. And we need to understand why they're doing what they're doing. Many white folks that were going to baseball games, particularly if they went to a black baseball game, they expected to be entertained in a way that they would not even thought about when they went to see a white baseball game.
Exactly.
They would expect the people to be clowns, grinning, shuffling,
Hmm.
doing all the things that they saw being before, or singing the things that they were doing on the stage, on the minstrel stage. And black baseball teams, at least in the 19th century, from what I've read, they refused to do it.
Hmm. Let me
So,
ask let me ask you this, since you touched on that and we talked about this. One of my earliest, and I mentioned to you, I grew up a huge baseball fan uh, in the 70s into the 80s, and I remember as a little kid, the Indianapolis Clowns, who I think were still touring around here or there, much like the Harlem Globetrotters were at the time, came. And that was exactly the performance that you're talking about. It was more of a vaudeville show that was put on. And that's what ended up being put the seed in people's minds that somehow, this is what it was. Why do you think they went back to that?
well, Philip, I don't think they ever left. I think the framing of black baseball, as we talked off the air, of being vaudeville, I added burlesque,
Mm-hmm.
and a wide ranging of things, minstrel show, which is the language that journalists use,
Mm-hmm.
it continued to be perpetuated across space and time. And let's be clear on concept. You know, and I know any of the movies that we may have seen that were done in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, some of the most famous white performers and entertainers,
Mm-hmm.
they cut their teeth on blackface performance,
Yep.
whether it be Bing Crosby or Jerry Lewis, or whether it was you name the guy, Shirley Temple. I mean, it all existed. It never went away.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with us is we have not been critical enough, particularly when it relates to baseball, to put it within that same context. So when you got the those baseball teams, and this is where I'm amused by it. Phil Dixon's book, and I've got that book, Pictorial History of the Negro Leagues. Great book, great photographs. It's just some things that, and due respect to him, I just disagree with it, because I don't think that the black baseball players in the 19th century saw themselves as a minstrel show. They were fighting against a system that said that they were minstrels.
Interesting.
So,
Interesting.
so again, we've got to tease this out, and I am very comfortable in engaging in a serious discourse with anybody on the 19th century up to 1900. Now, it can get kind of shady in the 1920s and 30s, where you've got these teams doing some of these things, but let's not confuse what I call, and I've written several articles on this for scholarly journals, of let's not confuse black style with minstrelsy.
Mm-hmm.
When you get a journalist that is present at a black baseball game, and that journalist is saying that these guys are too fancy or they're just flamboyant, you need to ask yourself the question is, what does that mean, too fancy or too flamboyant?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if he was a scrub or a muffer, or if he was somebody that couldn't play the game, that's one thing. But for you to turn back around and say that he's doing these other things that are extravagant, what that implies is this person is so good at what they do, they make it look easy. And as I talked to you offline,
Mm-hmm.
that's what Frank Grant was. He's a perfect example. But Frank Grant, because he played for a lot of white teams, he got a lot of publicity that acknowledged what he was doing was beyond comprehension for some of these writers that were attempting to describe what he was doing. But he wasn't the only one. There were black players in the 1860s and 70s that were just as good, and many of them, as I would argue, were as good as him, if not better.
Mm-hmm. So what are you working on now? I've got this up here now. I know you're working on you're part of this baseball iconography project. Um, what tell us a little bit about this?
Well, basically, this is spearheaded by John Thorne and Steve Getcher, and there's a baseball arts uh, Facebook page. The coordinator of that, we're all part of this team where we're starting to look at baseball in total and look at the wide range of mediums and artists that were uh, creating images of baseball across the board, not just black baseball, but images of baseball, and putting them within the context of what's important, what's consistent, and what has stood the test of time. So it could be anything from photography to painting to sculpture to lithography to objects. So the group has just been started over the last maybe month or so. So we're still in the process of looking at this long-ranging list that John Thorne put together. It's an incredible list
I
of
bet.
artists, and trying to tease these guys out and see who stands the test of time in terms of what their art. What's art, what's kitsch, what should stand the test of time, and what needs to be discarded. And obviously, it's going to be totally subjective, but uh, there are some artists that, as far as I'm concerned, that whether we like them or not, they need to be thrown in there. And one of them, I'm holding this book up here now. This is the Baseball Journal 12 that just came out a couple of months ago. And I submitted an article that was published in the journal. It's about Thomas Worth. And
Hmm.
Thomas Worth, if you know anything about him, he became famous or infamous for creating the Darktown series for Courier and Ives.
Interesting.
And some people may want to dismiss him as a hack, or they want to dismiss him as a racist, and he might have been all that, but this guy was a very good artist. He was well aware of the history of art because he shows it in his work. But he portrayed black baseball players, and what I talked to you earlier about, that minstrel style. The big eyes, the big lips,
Hmm.
the bony bodies, the clumsiness, and that whole range of things. And what my job was to do was provide a history of him and gain some measure of understanding about not only his contributions to the graphic or visual arts, but how he's responsible for helping to create this perception of black baseball players as burlesque or minstrel guys.
Hmm.
And we just can't dismiss him because we don't like him. He has to be put in context so that we can better understand how black baseball in the 19th century was imagined by the people at that time.
Hmm. That's right. I had someone just the other day say to me that this whole elevation of the Negro Leagues to Major League Baseball status, which to me was, they already were professionals, they were
Yes.
already major status. Finally, the recognition is there. But what they said was it was just the woke, you know, playing to the woke left kind of thing, which you can already tell where he was coming from.
Right.
Um, you know, how do you push back on that? I mean, what's the best way to push back on that? Because to me, like I said, we're having this conversation. I get it. I am trying my best to try to dispel with anybody that'll listen to me the myths that are out there. But there are just, I guess, some people that it just takes more than that. What do you do about it?
Well, two things. First of all, whenever I hear people use language that is um, clearly contemporary in the sense that this is something that this person has heard over and
Hmm.
over again, whether they're listening to right or left news media, is force them, if they're willing to be serious about what they're talking about, you tell me what woke means.
Hmm.
You define what woke means, and why is that significant to what you're talking about? And then I would have you contextualize to me. Are you telling me that black baseball players weren't as good as white ball players at any period of time?
Mm-hmm.
And if their position is they weren't, then the conversation is over.
Yeah, there's nothing. Yeah, that's I've
There's
discovered.
nothing. There's no conversation to be had.
Hmm. Yeah, I've unfortunately in some of my conversations and I have eventually just hit that wall where it's just all right, it is what it is. If you
Yeah,
that's what
and
you
again,
it's
it's
your
just
loss if that's what you want to believe.
yeah, and again, it may not even be a loss for them. And again,
No, that's
I'm
true.
I'm not trying to convince anybody.
No, no.
My position is in the work that I do. Don't just take for granted what I put in writing because I've documented my stuff seriously. And whether it's one baseball player or another one, I've tried to ensure that I've got 2 to 3 contemporary historical sources to back
Mm-hmm.
up what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them 10 to 20, depending on who the player is. And um, if you're going to be serious about exploring and examining black baseball, you got to move even beyond me. Now, if you want to do statistics, fine, but you got to get in there and do some work. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to tell you, Philip, the 19th century baseball is a piece of work.
Mm-hmm.
And many people don't want to do it because it takes too much time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if I work, for example, if I'm doing research uh, in a day, I may find nothing. And then here's a primary example. I'm close friends with a range of these guys, and finally discovered a team that I had been looking for the last 10 years, which was the Williamsburg Colored Unions from 1860. It took that long for me to find it. And again, there was a historian or a researcher out there that had access to the information, but refused to share the information.
Oh,
Can you
boy.
get it?
Yeah.
Didn't want to share it. And I don't know what they were holding back on. And finally uncovered the Sunday New York Mercury, and there it was, right there for all to see. September 1860, right there.
1860. Think about that. I mean, the Civil War hadn't even started yet.
Well, let's just blow you away. There's a couple of black teams, and these are the earliest that I have ever found or gained access to. 1855 out of Newark, New Jersey.
Amazing.
2 black teams playing. 1855.
Mm-hmm.
So we know these teams are there, man. It just requires some diligence, some patience.
My hats off to you, man. I think this stuff it's just so much work that it needs to be put out there, and you and so many others are out there doing it. I hope we can keep on pushing to get more people interested and more people inspired to help you guys out because I think
Yes, sir.
it's a worthwhile endeavor.
Well, both of us, we're getting old every day.
That's right.
And we need to have somebody to pick up this mantle and take it to the next stage.
That's right. You got any final thoughts? I could literally talk to you probably all day, like I told Phil Dixon last week, until the sun comes up. But I don't want to keep you. Maybe down the road, you get some more things that you've been working on. You ever want to come back on? That'd be awesome. But
Sure.
what any other? What's your closing thoughts on what we've been talking about?
Well, I just like to thank the viewers that are here, and I hope that this will inspire them to engage in black baseball in the 19th century, which I love dearly, and it's fun to me. I don't see it as work.
That's right.
I see it as work when I'm trying to educate somebody to move beyond, as we both acknowledge, that mythology thing, to deal with origins and engage in some critical thinking and serious research.
Mm-hmm.
And with that, Philip, I'd like to thank you for giving me an opportunity to share some thoughts.
Thank you.
And, I humbly appreciate the work that you're doing.
Thank you. I will keep pushing. I mean, this, like I said, this has been growing. Where we started with a few views and a few dozen views. Now we got hundreds of views. So we'll keep pushing this and keep it out there. I think as more people learn about it and more people start hearing your stories, the work that you guys and others are doing, it's fascinating. It's worthwhile, and I think we'll keep on growing this as it goes on here.
Sure, it'll happen.
All right, man. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you, Philip, and bless you.
All right. You be good. Bye bye.
Take care. Bye.
All right, everybody. I am going to flip it on over to the 1922 season and move us along here a little bit. Thank you to James Brunson for joining us there for a good hour and 25 minutes. That was a great conversation on early black baseball that I'm sure most people didn't realize goes back to the 1850s, and it's just to me just fascinating. And I encourage anybody who is so inclined to find out more. Every day on Twitter I try to put out some things that are are telling you that everywhere you look, from one end of the country to the other, there are some little echoes of this, and I think it's something that uh, if you ever feel inclined and you want to help out these guys and you find something out in your area and you want to let them know, I think they'd be more than appreciative to seeing what you got. So here we are on June 11th of the 1920 season, and I stopped here the other day because we had reached the June amateur draft, and I was planning on doing this today because I didn't want to wait too much longer. But I'm going to go ahead and make some picks here because I think it's something that I think would be fun to see. So let's see. Are we at the draft day? Let's take a look. No, it's tomorrow. So I'm going to move us one more day ahead so we can see in the standings. We had Detroit got a little hot here, 25-12 atop the Negro National League. One game up on the Chicago American Giants, two on the St. Louis Giants. The Kansas City Monarchs, four behind. And in the Eastern Colored League, the Bacharachs, three games up on the Cuban Stars East, and the rest of the league kind of languishing behind. So long season to go here. 140 games we're playing, and we're not even halfway home yet. So lots of things can happen. So I'm going to go ahead and play this day to get us to the draft. And again, this is Out of the Park Baseball 22. And as I pointed out, you can play this game by game, pitch by pitch if you wanted to. I just played one day in about 3 seconds, I guess it was. So we're at the first year player draft. So I wanted to go ahead and get this and get this part in there because I'm sure it'll be interesting. As we can see in the draft pool, we had stars like Cool Papa Bell, Turkey Stearns, Mule Suttles, Tubby Scales, Newt Allen, and others. So let's make sure the draft order is right. The Giants, the Black Sox, Philly. All right. I think it's a 5-round draft. So let's see. Let's take a look. So the Chicago Giants up first in the draft, and like I said, if it was me, I would take the sentimental pick of Cool Papa Bell. But let's take a look at what the Chicago Giants' weaknesses might be, and make the right pick for them. They've got Bobby Winston in left, 36 years old. Joe Green, they're an aging. Horace Jenkins is playing center field, probably a better left fielder or right fielder. He's getting up in age. Frank Duncan, Yeah, they definitely could use some young outfielders. So Cool Papa Bell would be a good pick. Turkey Stearns, I think, is the better pick. So we're going to select Turkey Stearns to the Chicago Giants. Quick look at Turkey, his known statistics, as we've talked about. Some fantastic seasons, 38 homers, 368 in 1925 with the Detroit Stars. He goes on to play. Look at that. I didn't even realize he played a few seasons with the Monarchs at the back end of his career, a little bit here. Some seasons on Chicago American Giants. But we're going to go ahead and select Turkey Stearns for the Chicago Giants. Next up, the Baltimore Black Sox. Let's take a look at what their needs might be. And you know, one thing you could see on here, there is a mock draft. So yeah, so Turkey Stearns was the mock draft, just like you would see in a regular, today's baseball environment. You've got the pundits that are going to have their view of who they think should be taken. So here is the pundits picking up who their mock draft would be. Where's the draft pool? Let me see here. We got some guys in here. I don't recognize some of these. Stanford Jackson. Who is this? He had a pretty nice career. Chicago American Giants. I don't recognize some of these names. I hope it didn't put some guys in here that don't belong, because that wouldn't be good. Let's take a look at the draft pool again. 133 players. I don't know who David Cortez is. Alex Crespo. I don't know who some of these guys are. I think it did that. John Sullender. I think it created some players that don't belong in here, which is no good. So we're going to try to weed them out. Doug Bauer, I don't know who that is. He's not a Negro Leaguer. So, let me just tell you why this would have happened. The game is going to look at the players that are available, and it's going to want to create a draft pool that would be the size needed in order to make that draft pool work. So it must have added in. Brandon Swink was definitely not a Negro League player, so we're going to get rid of him because those players were not here before, as you saw before in some of these draft picks. Travis Booth, don't know who that is. Tex Burnett, he was definitely playing. David Castaneda. Let me weed out some of these players that do not belong in here, and then we'll move along with the draft. We put a lot of players in here. And there's really no, I don't know if there's a way to prevent that or not, but it's unfortunate. I've had it happen in some of the other leagues that I've played as well. It will want to just put more guys in there because it thinks you don't have enough to have a draft. So we've got 200 players in here. I know we had a lot less than that. Bryant Taylor, Eric Whitmore. None of these guys are. I don't think Eric Whitmore was a Negro League player. He was not. Justin Anderson. That's a shame that it did that. Because now I got to waste some time here on these guys. Leroy Barber was, though. Mike Brooks, Jake Kane, these guys all have to go, unfortunately. I don't think John Check, no, none of these guys. Fred Coleman was not. I think that might be about it. Greg Foster was not. Rich G, who is that? He was a Negro Leaguer. How about that? So now we're down to 175 players, but they are still in here. Sorry, Kevin Haskett, you got to hit the road. Orlando Jablonski, there's a name for you. I don't think. Well, you never know. Orlando Jablonski, maybe the game. These are fictional players that the game has created. That in order to get to a full draft pool that it thought it should have, and now we're stuck with some guys we don't want in here. That's okay. Just take a minute here to weed out the fictional guys. I don't want any fictional guys running around in here. Dustin Make. Orlando Jablonski. Seriously. Yeah, that's a good one. James Moore, I don't think he was a no. Unfortunate that it did this, but that's all right. And you could tell immediately who the names are that are made up. There just is not going to be a name of Domingo Munoz in the league, unfortunately. Squire Moore, he was a real player. Brian Papp, too modern a name. Danny Porter, these are too modern a names to have in 1920. Steve Ryan, DJ, nobody, very few guys with Ethan Savage, that's another. Jaden, there's no Jadens living. Very few guys named Jaden back in 1920, I'm sure. Not a lot of Bryans as well. I don't think Paul Walzak, no. Elijah Ward, no. Henry Williams, yes. Mike Weissman, no. We're almost done. We're getting there. Ryan Workinger, Felipe Zuniga. All right. I don't think David Anderson. Cecil Cruz. Jesse Edwards. That doesn't sound. He was a Negro League player. How about that? Al Foster. So, like I said, the game has created. There's no Garths. Epi Hamilton was real, though. Yeah. So the game, in order to fill out a full draft pool, has stuck a full. It's filled it out with historical or fictional players. So I am trying to weed them out. Almost done, I believe. Jerry Ventura. How about Jack Thomas? He was real. Robert White. All right. I think I'm going to have to weed these out later because I don't want to waste too much time here. William Linder. That might be about it. Most of these names I read, there's no very few Joshes back then, or Brads. Not a lot of Brads living back in 1920. Craigs, that's another dead giveaway. Ians, not a lot of Ians were playing back in 1920. There was some Andys though. Manny Salvat. I think that might be it. I think we weeded them out. There might be a few that slipped through the cracks here. We'll take care of dealing with them at another time. But I don't want to waste too much time on this. So we go back to the draft. We've selected Turkey Stearns for the Giants. I think Baltimore. Who they got at first base? Let's take a look. They got Judd Wilson there. So they would not take Mule Suttles. Oh, Suttles can play the outfield as well. But I still think Cool Papa Bell is the pick here. So I'm going to draft Cool Papa Bell. St. Louis Giants. Let's see who they got going on at first base. Ooh, they got Heavy Johnson. He can catch, though. Doc Dudley, Charlie Blackwell, Sidney Brooks. So the pick here probably is Mule Suttles. But Tubby Scales is actually pretty solid, too. Man, this is a tough one. At second base, they could definitely... Scrappy Brown is who they have there now. Tough to pass up a guy like Tubby Scales as well, and Newt Allen. This is a tough one. Suttles can play first, third, left, center, and right. We're going to take Tubby Scales for St. Louis. Now the Hilldales. Boy, oh boy. Looks like Mule is definitely the pick for them. So we'll take Mule Suttles for the Hilldales. Dayton, who do they have at second base? I'm eyeing up Newt Allen here. David Wingfield. Yeah, it's kind of hard to pass up Newt Allen at this point. So let's take Newt Allen for Dayton. The Lincoln Giants. So I can go ahead and I can just have the AI select the player. So it's selected Charlie Mason, Suitcase Mason for the Lincoln Giants, right fielder. That brings the Cuban Stars West up. They select Jambo Jackson. And the Royal Giants take Big George Mitchell, the first pitcher taken in the 1920 draft. Goes to the Royal Giants, Big George Mitchell. Detroit Stars, John Henry Russell, another infielder. I'm just going to do the first round here. Tex Burnett to the Cuban Stars East. The Kansas City Monarchs take Branch Russell. And Atlantic City, Oscar Cannonball Owens. Indianapolis, shortstop C.H. Lindsay. And the American Giants, Chris Summers. See, he's a sorry. This is a guy that's going to sneak in there. I'm going to have to replace him, Chris Summers. So that's our first round. I'm going to go ahead and complete the draft. And we can take a look at who everybody else got. Johnny Jurin, Hooks Beverly to the Black Sox, Butch Glass to the Giants, Johnny Jones, Pep Hampton, Reuben Jones, Bobo Leonard to the Giants, Walter Davis to the Baltimore Black Sox. So it finishes the complete draft, and then it also leaves several players, if there's any left over, that will go into the 1921 draft. And they will end up being picked. So these guys, I'm going to have to take a look and see, because we got several players. This might be the guy that I stick on the Chicago American Giants to replace that other pick. I'm going to go ahead and do that. Oops. I'm just going to edit Larry Brown, put him on the American Giants, and then I'm going to go to the Chicago American Giants, take a look at their draft, and they took Chris Summers, and I'm just going to delete this player because I don't want a fictional player in here. All right, so that's our draft. Let me go ahead and play finish out this week to Monday, the 14th. And again, I appreciate James Brunson showing up today and spending some time with us. I thought that was um, fascinating, a fascinating conversation on early black baseball. So why do we got 21 players? Oh, Larry Brown. So yeah, we're gonna stick Larry Brown on the reserve roster. All right. I appreciate him taking the time. I think these conversations are great to have. I hope everybody is enjoying them, and I'm going to finish up until the 14th. Tomorrow night at 9 o'clock, we're going to have artist Greg Kreindler on. We're going to talk about his motivation for painting. I know he's got some great stories. I'm dying to find out some things like what's a color study? I mean, I know what they are. I've seen them, but it fascinates me when he puts these photos up on Twitter and other places to see these players. Many of those were used in the 184 card set that the Negro um, League Museum used and sold of the Negro Leagues. And then on Thursday night, we're going to have photographer Donna Muscarella, who did a great card set of Hinchcliffe Stadium, and she's doing some other work on Negro League photography, and we'll get to talk to her. And next week, Larry Lester. So we've got a full month almost in June as well. So I'll be posting more of these out there, and I hope everybody enjoyed it. Always fun, and we'll catch you guys next time. Thank you.